Welcome, everybody. Back by popular demand, we have Professor Greg, and we're going to go over one of the most fun decks to play in Star Wars CCG. This is Prophet, which has all the mains, all the toys, all the fun stuff, recreating a really iconic scene from the movies. This is using V cards, and it's in the open format, so it's going to be a little bit different than in a retro format, but we're really excited for this. So this is such a fun deck to play. I think we've talked about some janky decks. This one is incredibly fun to play, incredibly interactive. So, Greg, do you want to take it away with, once again, a super dope slideshow?
Yeah.
Props
Happy
here.
to. Yeah, and this is our first light side deck in this series. So excited to start working through it. So yeah, this is, sorry, let's get this going. So this is Prophet, or you can either profit by this or be destroyed. The premise, as you know, this is, Han has been frozen in carbonite. He's being held at Jabba's palace. He's being guarded by Jabba and his thugs. And the goal is to send our heroes out to, go in and save Han. And it's not an easy goal. And so the objective and starting effects that you play in this deck really help you to accomplish that goal. And then the flip side really pays you off quite well for doing so. And so let's get into it. We can just start looking at the zero side of this. What it first allows you to do is to deploy Jabba's palace and the audience chamber with a Han frozen there. And I'll say something about that in a second here. So you start with these two sites. They're both 2/1 sites. So you start with 4 force generation plus the 1 for you. You give your opponent 2. Now notice there's this little quirk here, which says opponent may deploy up to 2 aliens to audience chamber. So the idea is while Han starts frozen in carbonite at the audience chamber and your goal is to free Han, the opponent gets a really nice boon in this deck, which is that they get to start by deploying 2 aliens for free to the audience chamber. They could choose not to do that, by the way. They don't have to deploy those aliens, and there are some times where your opponent might choose not to. But oftentimes your opponent is playing aliens and has some good ones in their deck. And you're very likely to see, when you play Prophet, your opponent starting with someone like maybe Mara Jade with lightsaber or Sing with blaster rifle, coupled with Dr. Evazan and Ponda Baba combo, which makes characters go lost when they're hit. So they start with an alien with a weapon, and this character that can make your characters go lost when they're hit. So you might see that. If your opponent's playing Court or My Kind of Scum or Carbon Chamber Testing, you might see something like a Jabba, the Hut come down with an alien that can protect them. So just, be ready for this, that you in this deck are giving your opponent 2 aliens to start their game with at the audience chamber. Now, while the zero side of the objective is up, your opponent can't drain at the audience chamber. So while you do give them 2 characters to start with, there's a sense in which the goal of those characters is to keep you from flipping. And so the objective doesn't allow your opponent to drain while they're at the audience chamber. They can move away and drain, but insofar as they want to protect the audience chamber and keep you from flipping, they don't get to drain there. The objective also doesn't let you drain anywhere else on Tatooine. And so you can't just ignore, Han at the audience chamber and go drain elsewhere. This objective really incentivizes you going to the audience chamber, fighting, freeing Han to try to get this flip. So very fun in that regard. A couple other things about the zero side. Your Luke, your Artoo, and your Threepio deploy -2 at Jabba's palace sites, which is nice. Master Luke deploys for free. Master Luke is this card from the Enhanced Jabba's Palace set. It's got some really nice text. I'll talk about that later. And then the last thing is you flip this card if Han is on Tatooine and not a captive. For Han to be on Tatooine and not a captive, you have to control the audience chamber. So you need to kick your opponent off the audience chamber. You can then free Han. Once you free Han, this objective flips. And when it flips, you can immediately retrieve 5 force or 10 if Han is power -4. And then there's a couple other bits of text here, but let me say something, I think, briefly about your Han choices. So retrieve 5 force or 10 if Han has power less than 4. The 2 main Hans that people use in this deck are these 2. They're both virtual cards. The one on the left here is this Han that many people recognize from the Jedi pack. He had this blank game text, right? The PC made a virtual version of him with some actual nice game text that helps Prophet. And the first thing you'll see here is that force retrieval with or be destroyed is immune to secret plans. So or be destroyed is the 7 side of the objective. This is the 5 force you're retrieving. It's immune to secret plans. Secret plans is a shield that dark side is likely going to play, which makes you pay to retrieve force. So when you flip, you would normally have to pay 5 force to retrieve your 5 force or 10 force to retrieve your 10 force. This version of Han makes you immune to that, which is really nice. He's also got a bit of extra defensive value and armed with a blaster, which is nice. But really, one of the main reasons people use this is to be immune from having to pay to retrieve the 5 force with secret plans.
Random question. I guess whenever I've played, like, my Han's always been face down underneath, right? But does your opponent know which Han you're using? Like, is it possible, like, shield bait here a little bit if they don't know it's this Han?
I'm embarrassed to. So I agree, it is face down, but I think you reveal which one it is at the start.
I think that's right as well, but I just couldn't remember because it's always just like face down. I like never thought about it.
I'm pretty, someone could correct us in the comments. I'm pretty confident you reveal. So even if you keep them face down, they know which one it is. So they know whether to throw the shield or not, or whether they need to.
Yeah, that makes sense.
The other thing is the other version that's popular is this Solo. It's this episode 7 virtual version of Han. If you don't like the idea of an old man being frozen in carbonite under the audience chamber, you can use this version because the card goes over Smuggler's Blues. This one is nice. He also has just some nice game text. He draws a Battle Destiny on his own. He adds a Battle Destiny with Chewie or Rey. And then he's got this really nice once per game text where you can play an interrupt from your lost pile. So I'd say most decks play one or the other of these. I don't know if one or the other is more popular, but these are the 2 common ones you see. And I really don't think you see any others.
Yeah, no reason to play General Solo. It just doesn't work, right?
Yeah. And you might think, why not play a Han that has less than 4 power so you retrieve this 10 force? I mean, one thing to think about is you not only, if you use a version of Han that has less than 4 power to retrieve 10 force, you have to save up 10 force because if you're playing shield, your opponent's definitely going to play the shield. You have to save up 10 force to be able to retrieve that 10 force. You're spending an entire turn just paying to retrieve. And so that just is not a great prospect for most people. Also, it gives, to even lose the 10 force to be able to retrieve them, it gives your opponent a lot of time to set up their game. And so there's a lot of reasons, I think, to avoid trying to go for the 10 force retrieval and just focusing on the 5 force retrieval.
Yeah, makes sense. And then the best part is the ping damage.
The best part is the ping damage. So once you're flipped, during your control phase, your opponent loses 1 force for each battleground location that you occupy with Han, Luke, Leia, Chewie, or Lando. And so, there's this really great incentive to play some of our favorite characters in this deck because you have this nice ping during the control phase. Note, this is not a ping per character, but a ping per site. So if you've got all 5 of them on one site, you don't ping 5. You ping for each site, different site that one of them is at. And so, yeah, this flip is really nice because between the force retrieval and the ping damage, this is quite a powerful flip. All right.
How are we gonna free our boy?
How are we gonna free our boy? Well, the first thing that we want to think about in terms of freeing our boy is thinking about some starting effects that are going to help us do that. So one thing to know for those who play with the starting interrupt and starting effects, most people normally use heading for the medical frigate as their starting interrupt. The PC has made, which lets you start with 3 effects on the table, and you still could technically use that. But most people use this virtual card, Rendezvous Point on Tatooine, that the PC made specifically as a helper for Prophet, or at least a very similar kind of deck. Because as a starting interrupt, if you have deployed a Jabba's Palace site, which you have, it allows you to play Seeking an Audience, which we're going to do, and 2 others. And then after you use that starting interrupt, rather than it going to the lost pile, you can take that interrupt into hand. And then if you see the lost text on this, it allows you to deploy a Tatooine battleground. This is really nice because Prophet, if you noticed on the objective, it lets you start with those 2 sites, and there's no other way to pull sites using the objective. And so Prophet had no real other ability to get sights out. This is a really nice helper because it at least lets you get one other Tatooine battleground on the table by using this starting interrupt. And I'd say the two main ones that people use are either the Tatooine system. This is the far less common one because Prophet is normally a deck that's very thin in space, if it even has any space package at all, but it does allow you to get the Tatooine system, which is nice if you wanted to go that route. I'd say the one that most people use is the Jabba's Palace Antechamber. It's a 2-1 site, and it's a -1 to 4 strain for your opponent. So this is a way to get a nice other battleground down, 2 extra force, -1 to 4 strain. I'd say this is the one that most people use and that I use as well. So that's your starting interrupt. Now here are these 3 main starting effects. Let me say something about why these are the 3 effects. So think back to our objective. Your objective on the 0 side makes it cheaper to deploy Luke, Artoo, and Threepio. And on the 7 side, you've got this ping damage that you can do with Han, Luke, Leia, Chewie, or Lando. Well, let's start with Seeking the Audience. Here's this really nice effect that lets you dig into your reserve deck and grab Lando or Jabba's Palace Lando, a Jabba's Palace Leia, any version of R2-D2, and any version you want of Threepio, which are the very characters, or at least some of the very characters that deploy cheaply through the objective and that help you with your ping damage. And so Seeking an Audience is really nice to be able to pull these cards. This is the original version of Seeking an Audience. There is a virtual version of Seeking an Audience that has, I'd say, some costs and benefits. The benefits are that you have a lot more leeway in terms of the personas that you can grab with it. So the first thing to notice is that now you can grab Threepio, Chewie, Lando, Leia, and Artoo. So you've added Chewie into the mix, which wasn't on the original Seeking an Audience. And other than a restriction of not being able to deploy Reflections 3 Chewie and Reflections 3 Lando and Reflections 3 Leia, you can deploy any other persona of Chewie, Lando, and Leia, whereas the original Seeking an Audience only allowed you to deploy Leia and Lando that had the Jabba's Palace icon. So it gives you a lot more wiggle room in terms of the personas you could use. The cost is that it now costs 2 force to grab each one from your reserve deck, whereas the original Seeking an Audience, it was free to do so. Which you use is up to you. I use the virtual version because I like the sort of more leeway in terms of which personas I'm allowed to grab. The last thing about Seeking an Audience is that it's got this final bit of text that says once per game can place the effect out of play to retrieve an alien or an independent starship into hand. And no, the main 2 Han personas that most people use are both aliens. And so using this effect, the virtual version of the effect, is a really important way to potentially get back Han if you've lost him. And maybe I forgot to mention this, when you're on the 7 side of the objective, if you lose Han, the objective flips back to the 0 side. And so this is a way to get Han back in your hand and get yourself to flip back to the 7 side.
And the retrieval is only once per game, so you don't get to retrieve again.
It's once per game, and that's right. So you can't keep recycling him, and the effect is gone too, so you no longer get to dig into your reserve deck and pull these characters out. So you really expend the card, but if it gets you back a Han, then it's potentially worth it, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's probably the biggest risk of playing Prophet in general, is if you lose Han, you could be absolutely screwed, right? If you have no way of getting him back. Because you're not usually running more than one in the deck. You run the one that's underneath.
That's right. I mean, I've never played with more than one. Yeah.
So you can just be really screwed if he gets hit by a weapon and then suddenly you can't force strain on Tatooine. Like you're just like, all my guys are stranded with nothing to do.
Yes, it'd be pretty terrible. I mean, you can still try to go for a beatdown strategy, but yes, you're like absolutely right that it would that it makes your life very, very difficult. So you really want to be able to get him back. The next one is a virtual version of I Must Be Allowed to Speak. And so again, remember, you've got the 7 side of the objective that allows you to ping with Han, Luke, Leia, Chewie, or Lando. You've got Seeking an Audience that allows you to grab Chewie, Lando, Leia, and Threepio and Artoo, right? And now you've got this so you've got the objective that pays you off for having them. You've got an effect that helps you to get them. And now I Must Be Allowed to Speak is a really nice effect that when you deploy them allows you to pull any cards you want from your use pile. And so this is just this is going to be really important. I'll talk about it later. A really important way to get key cards into your hand, because every time you deploy one of those characters, you scan through your use pile and take whatever card you think is best into hand. It also cancels None Shall Pass, which you're not going to see often, but you might see in a court deck or a My Kind of Scum deck, like people potentially saw in mine. And then the last bit of text on this is that once per game, you can deploy a farm from the reserve deck. And, one farm you might be thinking about is the Lara's Moisture farm. I use a virtual version of the farm, which is a little better than the non-virtual version of the farm, but up to you. But this is another key way to get another battleground site on the table, a bit more force generation from you, again, in a deck where the objective is not helping you pull out cards.
And this is just going to be an expensive deck to run as well, as far as the force generation. It's very force hungry, as you said before.
Yeah, I mean, because you really, we'll talk about it a little later, but there's a lot of characters you want to deploy, and those characters cost force to put out, right? And so, if you only had the 4 or 5 force you were starting this deck with, that would clearly not be enough. So with this farm and the starting interrupt, you're now at least at 8. And I'll say a bit more about more force generation later. The last effect that I start, and this is maybe not as essential as the other two, but I'd say it's close to being sort of default start, is Jabba's Last Chance, a virtual card, which gives Chewie, Lando, and Leia a bit of immunity to attrition. More importantly, once per turn may deploy a unique character weapon. So, you've got some really great characters in this deck, and here are some really great unique character weapons that you might want to put on them, like Leia's Blaster, Han's Blaster, Luke's Lightsaber, and so on. There's also a bit of a fun once per game text with R2-D2 about exchanging a card in hand with a card in reserve deck, which can be really useful as well. But generally speaking, this is how you get your weapons out on those characters that you're deploying. And those are the 3 main starting effects that I would recommend, that I use. There's one more effect that you might think about throwing into the mix, not necessarily starting, because I think it's more important to have the one that pulls your weapons. But a good Blasterberry side is another virtual effect that basically pings your opponent for control, is occupier control, controlling for when you control while holding a non-lightsaber weapon. So this is like the You'll Be Dead card we talked about in the Invasion deck. And so this deck is already pinging on the 7 side. This just adds an extra ping if you have these character weapons on these characters, which you want to have. And so this is, I think, potentially worth floating in your deck.
I just want to say I love this incentive to get character weapons out, because Leia's blasters, I've just never used it because it's generally weapons suck, right? And it's nice to see a little bit of love for, or incentivizing people to use weapons, right? Character weapons.
And Leia's blaster rifle is quite a good weapon, which I have another slide later with that. It's a fun one. If you can hit, it's really a devastating weapon. So. Yeah, and this is and so anyway, this is fun. I recommend floating it, but I don't know this one is as essential as the other 3, which I think people should definitely be playing in this deck. So now you can see the way this deck is working. You've got your you've got the objective, you've got these effects that work really synergistically with it. And the main strategy, which is not surprising at this point, is, getting the heroes on the table. And there are a lot of options for all of these characters, right? Because there are so many different personas in Decipher Star Wars CCG and with virtual cards of each of these characters. So I just want to say something about some of your persona options while building this deck. I'm not going to go into crazy detail. Obviously, we know which general persona should be here, and I just want to say something about which the popular ones are and why. So starting with Luke, you have 2 different versions of Master Luke you can use, one non-virtual, one virtual. Remember, this Master Luke deploys for free on the 0 side. The original non-virtual Master Luke is really nice because he has this text that potentially can send opponents' aliens back into their hand, which is a really important way to get aliens off the table. You've got a virtual version of Master Luke that just resets your opponent's battle destiny while he's alone at a site if your opponent doesn't have character stability greater than 3. He's also got a once per game text of deploying a lightsaber on him from Lost Pile. So if you potentially lost that lightsaber or lost another Luke and that lightsaber has gone to Lost, you can deploy another version of this one and get that lightsaber back. And then you've got this virtual version of Luke Skywalker Rebel Scout, which is, obviously a stronger character and has more immunity to attrition. He's got this really nice text where you can, if you pull him for Destiny, you can take him into hand to redraw. and his weapon destiny draws are +1, and your opponent has to use 1 force to fire a weapon. And so he's really nice as well. And I will say many people play different versions. So you might have 2 or 3 Lukes in your deck, and you might have like 1 Master Luke and 1 Luke Skywalker Rebel Scout. That's a totally common way of using these personas. And if you're going to use Luke, you should probably throw in Luke's Bionic Hand, this virtual card that gives a boost to Luke's power and immunity to attrition, which makes him just far more of a beast. And it's got this really nice text about exchanging a card in hand with an interrupt and lost pile. So if you've lost a key interrupt and you've got something in your hand that you don't need as much, you can send that to lost to take a key interrupt from the lost pile into your hand.
I just love seeing a device be used for something useful rather than like whatever the original text was for this image. I can't remember, but like it was probably useless, right?
Yeah, it was. So this is a Cloud City card. It was just a Bionic Hand, I think, is the one that, yeah, it's written right there. It goes over Bionic Hand. I don't even remember the text of it anymore, but the PC has done a nice job with taking cards that weren't getting a lot of use and giving them some fun text. So those are your Luke choices, and I think it's worth throwing in a Bionic Hand as well. It's also got a 7 destiny, so even if you don't have it on the table, if you're drawing it, other than for a sense draw, it's a great card to draw. And then there's also a couple different versions of Leia. There's this Reflections 3 Leia Rebel Princess, which is just a beast because she can cancel Force Drains at related sites by retrieving cards from the Lost pile. You've got your General Leia from the Force Awakens version of General Leia, who's got some really nice, stats, a good deploy forfeit ratio, but also you retrieve force when you initiate battle with a resistance character. She's a resistance character, but so are, by the way, Solo, if you're using that version of Solo, Chewie, which you should use some version of, Rey, which is just a really great card. So if you use that version of General Leia, that works really well with other resistance characters because you're retrieving force whenever you battle. And there's actually a brand new version of Leia that goes over this. This was also another enhanced Jabba's Palace version of Leia Boost, this Spy Leia. This just came out in the most recent set, and this has some really nice text as well. One, it makes your characters immune to Imperial Barrier, which is nice, and she adds a battle destiny, or adds a destiny to attrition when with Chewy, but also once per game, you can take up Someone Who Loves You. And Someone Who Loves You is this used interrupt that has a couple bits of text on it, but one of which is that if Leia is present where Han is captive, you can just release Han immediately. So normally to release the captive, you need to control the site. This allows you to release Han even when you don't control the site, flipping you to the 7 side even without controlling the audience chamber. And this version of Leia just lets you get that card directly into hand. So, and again, this is another situation where you potentially have a couple Leias, maybe 2 Leias in your deck. I used to use Rebel Princess and General Leia. General Leia is pullable with Seeking an Audience, but Leia Rebel Princess was not, but it was a nice thing to float. I don't know what I'm going to do now that the Boosh is out in terms of which 2 I use, but that is, just keep that in mind, that you don't have to limit yourself to 1 here or 1, 2 of the same type.
So notably no Leia with Blaster though. I'm just curious because that's the Leia I run in my like retro Prophet deck, but she just kind of gets bumped out.
The reason I didn't include Leia with Blaster or Han with Blaster or any of those or Luke with lightsaber is because I'm using that starting effect that allows you to grab their weapons. And so it's a waste to use the EPP versions. There's probably a version of this deck where you can run all EPPs and then you don't need that starting effect and you can potentially focus on a different strategy. But I think it's a better and stronger strategy to have the actual weapons.
I'm sold on it, man. I like having weapons. I think it's fun.
Look at that. 1 convert. 2 main versions of Chewy that I think most people like. There are, notice I'm not showing all the versions that we can show. There are clearly a lot of personas of these characters. I'm really just going through the main ones that people use. And I'm not really saying anything about like why we're not using the other ones. I'm happy to field those questions, but it would just be too much to say, and here's why we're not using this or that. But certainly if you're curious about why, I'm happy to answer. But most people use either the Chewy Protector from Reflections 2, who has nice text because he deploys more cheaply to the same set as Leia, and can potentially blank the game text of opponents' characters if they have power less than 4. So he's got some really nice game text there. Chewy with Bowcaster is also nice just because it's an EPP. So Chewy has an embedded weapon on him, which is a really nice weapon because it not only targets characters, but targets vehicles as well. So this can take out like AT-ATs pretty well. And again, this is a resistance character that would work with the General Leia as well. So those are your two main options there. You have two main Lando options. One is this Lando Vibro-Ax, which is not from Enhanced Jabba's Palace. This is from the Jabba's Palace sealed deck, I think. This is a really nice one. He deploys more cheaply to Tatooine, and he adds a Battle Destiny on Tatooine, and he's got an embedded weapon that allows you to potentially exclude characters from battle. So that's a really nice one. You've got your Reflections 3 Lando as well, but remember this Reflections 3 Lando is not pullable by seeking an audience, but he also adds a Battle Destiny and has some retrieval. It's this maintenance version. I use the Lando with Vibro-Ax. I don't use the Scoundrel. I think some people potentially play both, but I just use the Vibro-Ax one. You've got a couple R2 options as well, each of which has like interestingly different text that is worth thinking about. The original Jabba's Palace R2, if he's at a battleground of C-3PO, you can subtract 1 from each of opponent's Battle Destiny draws at same and related sites. So across all of Tatooine, which is a really nice text. You've got a virtual version of that same one that allows you to place an opponent's, once per game, place an opponent's interrupt out of play. And he adds a Destiny, or you can draw a Destiny and subtract that from your opponent's attrition if he's with Anakin or Luke, who you should have in this deck. So that's some nice text. This A New Hope virtual R2 also has some nice text because he adds, so these are all spies. This version of R2 also adds a light side icon when he's present in a scomp link, which means that you can take this R2 and deploy him to your opponent's 2-0 site or 1-0 site. And then now that he adds that icon, you can now deploy other characters there and potentially set up a big drain at your opponent's 2-0 site. So these all have, interestingly different text, and they're all worth thinking about. I'd say the only one where there's only one choice you should be considering is this Threepio with part showing. This is just by far the only Threepio you should use because he's got this really amazing text that once per turn, you can take a card from your hand, put it on the top of your use pile, and draw the top card of your reserve deck. So what this allows you to do is it allows you to cycle out cards you don't need from your hand and draw cards from your reserve deck that are potentially better than the one that you put down in your use pile, hopefully. You can do this once per turn, so that is both on your turn and your opponent's turn, so it's 2 times around. And because he's pullable with the objective, you can get him turn 1. So you should just absolutely play this Threepio. And he works really well with this effect from Jabba's Palace, a gift, an immediate effect. If you just moved a droid to the audience chamber, which we'll talk about later, you deployed on that droid, he becomes an undercover spy. So boom, you've got yourself an undercover spy. Wherever opponent has an alien, their Battle Destiny draws are -2 and 4 strains are -1 wherever they have an alien. And so this is some really strong text, especially because if your opponent has chosen to deploy aliens to the audience chamber, it immediately affects them and potentially other aliens that they're putting elsewhere on Tatooine or elsewhere in the galaxy. So a gift is a really nice card for a number of different reasons. There is a virtual version of a gift that the PC made, and I think it's a really tough choice to figure out which of these is the better one to play. Same thing if you moved your droid to the audience chamber, now you deploy it on table as opposed to on Threepio. It doesn't make him an undercover spy. But what it does do is force loss from or be destroyed can't be reduced and is limited to 3. Let me say something about it in a second. There's other text. While Han is with your non-hit Chewie, Lando, or Luke, Han can't be targeted by weapons. So that last bit of text is really nice because as long as you've got Han with Chewie, Lando, or Luke, and they haven't been hit by weapons, Han can't be targeted. And this is a really key way to potentially protect Han from being targeted by weapons, which is something that your opponent's going after Han, right? They're coming down with lightsabers, they're coming down with guns, and they're going to try to kill Han first thing. And so this is a way to protect Han, which is nice. The thing about or be destroyed, that's the 7 side of your objective that allows you to do the ping. Now, it limits it to 3, meaning you can't spread to more than 3 sites, but it also can't be reduced. And there are dark side cards that basically reduce your ability to ping, like Imperial Decree, which potentially if you had spread to 3 sites and we're pinging at all 3, Imperial Decree would reduce that to a ping of 1. So a gift keeps, and a Imperial Decree is not necessarily in every deck, but you know, it's in decks and you might come across it. And so this gift keeps your pings from being reduced. It protects Han. The other gift gives you an undercover spy and reduces your opponent's force strains and battle destinies. And I think it's like really tricky to figure out which is the better one. Play around with them and see which one you liked better is I think what I would suggest here. Okay. Or sorry, do you have something?
No, go ahead. Let's see the weapon package.
So the weapon package doesn't need to be large, but these are the ones I showed you before. Leia's blaster is really great. Leia's blaster is fantastic, even though it's not a lightsaber, you're only drawing at +1. Characters that are hit by Leia are immediately lost. And so while it might not be easy to hit, when you do hit, it can be a real trouble for your opponent. Yeah. Han's Heavy Blaster. This is a virtual version of Han's Heavy Blaster. This one's nice. You're drawing at +2, which is okay. The really key thing about this is, one, it allows Han to fire this during the control phase. So you could potentially take a character out in the control phase. And you can put the weapon in the use pile to cancel a weapon destiny targeting Han. So if your opponent swung at Han with a lightsaber and the first one isn't enough and the second one would have been enough, you can just get rid of this weapon, put it into the use pile, weapon destiny canceled. So this is, again, another way to protect Han, who you really want to keep in this deck. And then Luke's lightsaber, you know, is Luke's lightsaber. You put it on Luke. Anakin's lightsaber is another one you should think about using in this deck. You've got the original non-V version that goes on any Skywalker, so Luke or Leia. There's a virtual version that goes, it doesn't go on Leia, it still goes on Luke, but it also goes on Anakin or Rey, which are 2 cards that are just really popular in the meta these days, virtual cards that I think are, you know, no-brainers for including in this deck. Anakin's great, he's got some great text. You can initiate battles for free. And his weapon destiny draws and your battle destiny draws are +1. And Rey is another really nice card. She gives you a youth pile pull when you deploy her, like your starting effect does. And she also adds 1 to battle destiny draws, allows you to take the bottom card of your force pile into hand each turn. So this, you know, Rey is another great card, and you can put a lightsaber on her. There's also, this is Rey from Force Awakens. There's another Jedi Knight Rey from the last movie, which doesn't give you those used pile pulls, doesn't give you the +1 to destinies, but does allow you to once per game deploy a lightsaber on her from the reserve deck, which is nice if potentially you want to deploy more than 1 weapon from the reserve deck in a turn. She's also got some nice retrieval. So I would definitely play some version of Rey, some version of Anakin. There's other versions of Anakin as well, but this is the one I could recommend, or I would recommend. I don't know if you need more than these 4 weapons. Some people play more than that. These are the only 4 that I play in my deck.
This is kind of a newbie question. It's because I don't play open really at all, but the persona rules are just like suspend. Like you can have Anakin as well as Vader on the table at the same time, right?
Correct.
Okay.
Correct. Yeah.
I didn't know how that worked.
Yeah, I think it's you know, there's some justification for it, and you know, I'd mess it up right now if you pushed me on it. But like, you can't have like those 2. You can't have the light and dark version of Lando at the same time, or Lobot at the same time. But you can have Anakin and Vader at the same time. For a similar reason that I think you can have like Senator Palpatine and you know the Emperor at the same time. Yeah.
It does feel less thematic to have Anakin and Rey there, but it's cool. Whatever. Yeah, we're traveling through time here.
Let's see. Last character I'm going to say something about is you should have some version of Obi-Wan. There's 2 main ones. There's the special edition Obi-Wan that's really nice because once per turn, if a battle just ended, you can revive a character that was just lost to the that you just forfeited to the lost pile. So this is a way to potentially lose a Han or a Luke or a Leia and get them right back on the table. So this is a really nice persona of Obi-Wan from Special Edition. There's a virtual version of the Premier Obi-Wan that's also nice because once per game you can exchange 2 cards in hand with any card in the lost pile. This is again another way to potentially get back your Han or any other key card. And this is, you know, I would choose one of these and, you know, play around with them, see which one you like the best, see which one you think works with your strategy the best. There are so many other characters. There are too many other characters for me to like go through. I would say just look around. There is, for those of you who are on the PC forums, I would totally suggest there is a text-based primer for this deck that like lists a lot more. So there's like an area of the forums that have primers and tutorials, right? There is one for profit out there that was made by Matt Lutz, CRG, and he's got a bunch more characters listed that you could, scan through if you don't want to do your own digging. But I'm not going to go over other characters that have more than these characters, but there's just too many to list.
Okay, let's go to turn 1 here. Oh,
We're
battle.
not ready. I'm sorry.
There's some battle helpers here.
Let's go to some battle helpers. So before we actually talk about these turn ones, I just want to say, like, you've got these characters that I've been talking about. Here are some red cards that you should be thinking about using in this deck that are going to help your strategy. Now, here's ones that I like that I don't know that everyone works with this strategy, but I think these are really fun. These are the cards that if you've got some of these personas together, adds battle destiny. So if Luke and Leia are in a battle, add 2 destiny. If Leia and Chewie are in a battle together, add 2 battle destiny. If Leia and Han, add 2. If Han and Chewie, add 2. All these cards have other text as well, but they also have this text that adds multiple battle destinies if you've got these characters together, which most of the time you have. So I think these are some really fun cards to put in here that can really be devastating if you can pull even one or more than one of these off and you start drawing like a lot of battle destinies. So I think these are fun. I use them. I would recommend them. There's, like with the characters, there's just too many other interrupts to list that are relevant. So Clash of Sabers to exclude an opponent's character from a battle. Dodge to subtract 3 from each of your opponent's weapon destiny draws when they've targeted a character or run a character away from a battle. It could be worse to lessen your forced retrieval. Nabrun Leids to transport your characters from one site to another. A slight weapons malfunction to add a battle destiny. A sorry about the mess to fire during your control phase or make a just hit character lost. A weapon levitation to dig into your use pile and get a key weapon into hand or steal your opponent's weapon. You do have your moments to cause a redraw of a destiny or to add +3 to a destiny you just drew to, let's say, break the attrition of your opponent's character. Run Luke Run to run Luke into a battle. I think I can handle myself to either add to drain or cancel a weapon destiny targeting a female character. Jedi's Concentration, a Jedi's Resilience, a Blaster Defection to keep your characters from getting targeted by weapons. There's just so many and more. And again, this is another place where I would potentially recommend folks do some digging or go to this primer that CRG made on the forums that lists in more comprehensive way a lot of interrupts that you might think about using.
And I'll toss a link to that primer in the video description. So there'll be
sure, that'll be a great idea.
So people can just go check that out.
One last thing before we get to turn 1. Your face package.
Ooh.
It's not clear there is a space package in this deck, so sorry. Most people who play Prophet don't really have space or have the most minimal space. So I actually don't play any space in my deck. I used to do a kind of Akbar Home 1 package, and I'd have Rebel Leadership, and I'd use that to maybe grab Akbar and then also use that to add or limit destinies. But it's really hard to like get these cards into your hand. Potentially you can't get them. You have to wait too long to get them, or you have to use your used pile pulls to get them, which you really don't want to be doing to get them. You want to be using them for other things, for battling at the audience chamber. So I ditched that. Some people will play a landing claw and starship strategy, even with like the most basic starship, like a Y-Wing. Landing claw is a way it allows you to attach your ship to an opponent's capital starship, and then you can unattach it anytime. And so basically it blocks your opponent from draining while still allowing you to detach and have presence in space, so that if you're shielded so that you have to pay for your drains on the ground, you have presence in space so you don't have to pay for them. The landing claw strategy is maybe worth thinking about, but a lot of people also don't even have any space package at all. Okay, so with that out of the way, let's get to turn 1. I'm actually not going to sort of talk through in detail, running through all the various turns. I think most of the discussion here is really what we've done so far was thinking about those characters, thinking about how they work with the starting effect and the objective. But I will say a couple things talking people through like how to think about the setup and some other things here. So let's say it's turn 1. You've got your 2 sites out. You've got your objective. You've got your 3 starting effects. Your opponent has placed 2 characters down at the audience chamber. You've got your Han, frozen in carbonite there. And okay, you're starting. First thing you want to do is take that rendezvous point on Tatooine, which you got into your hand after using it to start those effects. pull a battleground, pull this antechamber, then use your I must be allowed to speak to pull a farm, get that force generation out. One thing that's nice about being able to use these two different cards is now you have, you've got 8 force generation right away. One thing to note, you should absolutely do this in the order I just said. First rendezvous point on Tatooine, then I must be allowed to speak. Do you know why, Matt?
I don't know why. Tell me why.
So rendezvous point allows you to deploy any Tatooine battleground. I must be allowed to speak specifically allows you to deploy a farm. In your first turn, it's very, very likely, you've only generated 5 force or whatever it is, maybe a little bit more. It's very likely that at least one of those is in your reserve deck, but it might not be that both of them are in your reserve deck. If you use I must be allowed to speak first and the farm isn't there, you've lost that pull. It's a once per game action, right? And you can't do it again. Whereas if you use rendezvous point first, the odds that one of those two is in there is much better. And so you're very likely to hit at least one of them with rendezvous point, if not the one you really want, still allowing you to grab the farm. And it doesn't allow your opponent to verify your reserve deck, because if you miss a pull, your opponent verifies. So start with rendezvous point. Now, the next thing to sort of note about this, you've got these 2 sites out. This is not a lot of force generation. If this is all you have. So a lot of players at this point will play, Whisa's got a Grand Army to grab the Naboo Boss Nass Chambers, which is a 2/0 site. To do that, you probably want to have like 2 or 3 Whisas in here. You don't quite need the 4 that you would normally need. Given your use pile pulls, given your Threepio cycling, you probably only need 2 or 3. I use 2. I think some people use 3. But this gets you some key extra force. So you've deployed your sites. Use your Seeking an Audience. You've now, by the way, you should know whether Threepio is in your reserve deck or not. But if he is in your reserve deck, or if you had him in your hand, use the Seeking an Audience to grab that Threepio, put him down. It might cost you 2 force from the Seeking, but remember he's deploy -2 from the objective. Remember that he works really well with a gift, so you want to have a gift in your hand. How do you get a gift? Because you've only got one of them. There's no card that I've talked about yet that lets you get it. Here's how you get a gift. You put out the Don't Do That Again shield, assuming you're playing with shields, which you should be. You play this on table once per game, take an immediate effect into hand. And again, when you were looking for those sites earlier, you should have seen whether a gift was in your reserve deck. Assuming it is, you play the Don't Do That Again, you grab the gift. That doesn't go on Threepio yet. That goes in your hand. You only put that on Threepio when he moves at the end of the turn to the audience chamber. Now a gift goes on him. And if you're using the original version, now you've got yourself an undercover spy and all that text kicks in. And so that's your turn 1 in this deck. Very, very rarely are you ever doing anything else turn 1 other than drawing up some force. Now, for the... Sorry, was that?
I said just preparing for turn 2.
Now there's a lot. This is where it starts. I mean, you actually aren't doing much yet, but this is where it starts. You start getting, like, it's nerve-wracking in this deck, because the next couple turns, turn 2, turn 3, maybe up to turn 4, you're building your hand. Because remember, your goal is to come down to the audience chamber and free Han. Your opponent started with 2 aliens there for free, but they're gonna back it up. I mean, sometimes your opponent, if they might have a strategy where they just abandon it and run away and just start draining you elsewhere, in which case you follow them with 3PO, right, if you can. But oftentimes your opponent's going to back this up, and so very quickly they're going to have a pretty strong force here. So you need to have a lot to come down with. So your first couple of rounds, you just really want to be cycling cards of 3PO, getting, trying to get some key cards you need, taking up cards from your force pile, saving a lot of force, since you're going to need a lot of force to come down. The amount of force you generate in one turn is not enough. So you really want to be drawing cards up, cycling with 3PO, saving a lot of force, gearing up to the big deploy in battle. And so when you're ready to deploy, you really just need to now think about these different effects and how they're going to help you do this. That is, think carefully about how to deploy your characters to maximize your used pile pulls and get what you want on the table. One thing you might want to do if you've been building your hand for the last 2 rounds and you're ready to deploy, use the game text on something like the audience chamber, which says may deploy Boshuda from reserve deck. Now, you don't have Boshuda in this deck, but it allows you to look at your deck. So your opponent will verify your reserve, which isn't great, but what more importantly, you get to verify your reserve. And when you verify your reserve, you can, for instance, look for a key character that you don't have in your hand yet that you can potentially pull if Seeking an Audience. Or look for a key weapon that you're going to want to use the Jabba's Last Chance effect to deploy on a character. So it'll tell you which of those things are in your reserve deck, and also it'll tell you what's not in your reserve deck, meaning it'll tell you what's in your force pile. And so now you have a sense for what kind of cards you're going to be using to deploy these characters, which will then be in your use pile when you do your use pile pulls. So glance at your deck and have a sense of what's in the reserve and what's in the force, so you know where things are and what you can now do with these effects.
So
now,
notably, none of this stuff will pull Luke out, though. Like Luke, you just need to draw. Right?
Luke, you just need, that's right. Notably, one of the strongest characters you want out is the one that it doesn't let you pull, I think, on purpose, right? So you want to be looking for him. You want to be, hope maybe you got him with Threepio. Maybe you have enough personas in there to you've just gotten lucky and got him, or you get him from a used pile pull, right? So, but yeah, none of them will let you pull them. And now you've looked, you're ready to deploy. I should know, if you know you're going to deploy a very specific character that's not your Chewie, Lando, Leia, and Luke, like if you know you're going to deploy Rey or Anakin or Ahsoka or whoever it is, Obi-Wan, deploy them first. If you know 100% you're going to deploy them first before you deploy your other characters. Why? You want to deploy them first because you want to maximize the number of cards in your used pile when you do those used pile pulls. So you don't want to deploy Chewie and Lando and do your use pile pulls and then deploy Obi-Wan for 5 force and get nothing out of it. You want to deploy Obi-Wan first, have those extra 5 force in there, and then deploy Chewie. So you have more cards to choose from. So keep that in mind, do that. And then the one thing you want to be doing as you're doing these use pile pulls is think about which characters are in your hand, think about which weapons you're using, think about the cards you need to sort of win this battle, right? And that's what you should be looking for in your use pile. So think about what you have in your hand and what's going to work with it, and think about what your opponent has at the audience chamber and what's going to be most effective against that. And those are the cards you should be looking for. I should say, figuring out what the right card is to pull is like the hardest decision I have playing in this game with any deck, right? So like that, there are so many options sometimes, and figuring out which is the right one is just so nerve-wracking. And it's really kind of, this is like the key thing to this deck, is thinking carefully about what are the interrupts or characters or weapons or whatever that you need here.
Okay, we're on to turn 2. We're on to the big battle here.
Yeah, we're on a big, so I mean, I don't know what turn we're on at this point. This might be turn 2, this might be turn 3. It's usually, you know, we can say average of turn 3. This is when you're now deploying. 2 might be a little quick. You don't have enough force yet. You haven't built your hand enough. 4 might be a little late, right? But like it's somewhere in that vicinity you're doing this. Now, I'm not going to talk through the battling really. I'm just going to say, you know, once you've done that and now you've done this deploying, the mid game is really about freeing Han or potentially winning by a beatdown, which is to say that like one way to win is to go down to the audience chamber and battle and free Han. But I should note that it's not uncommon that just in the course of coming down with this gigantic force and these cards that are making your opponent's characters go lost and adding battle destinies, you might have a huge overflow battle early on. Your opponent concedes and you've never even freed Han. So that's certainly, you know, possible and sometimes likely to happen in a deck like this. But assuming that hasn't happened, you know, let's say you've cleared the site, you've got your characters down, you now control, right? And so remember, with the objective here, this card flips to the 7 side if Han is on Tatooine and not a captive. So that's an automatic flip, right? So as soon as he's on Tatooine, not a captive, it flips to the 7 side, and then you immediately retrieve the 5 force. Although, you know, keep in mind, depending on which persona you're using, make sure you have 5 force saved up to pay for secret plans if you're using a persona where you have to do that with. Another thing to note is to watch out for this shield. Come here, you big coward, which basically how it works is if your opponent puts the shield out and they occupy any battleground anywhere, if you don't occupy at least 2 battlegrounds, all of your force retrieval is canceled. And so this just stops you from retrieving force unless you're on 2 battleground sites, which is why I say while the 0 side flips automatically to the 7 side, you can choose when to free Han once you control the site. And you might wait to free him in case your opponent has the shield out or in case you don't have enough force to pay to retrieve force until those conditions are met. Then you free him and then you're ready to pay or to be allowed to retrieve. And so now you've got Han free, you're on the 7 side, and then once you're on the 7 side, now this deck moves into, I think it's late game, which is draining, pinging, and battling elsewhere, which is to say, you know, you've freed Han. Let's say you've got some other characters on. You definitely want to not just be at one site. That's not really enough. So let's say you're at 2 sites and you've got your forces on these sites and they've got their weapons. You've got a lightsaber at each site. So one thing that kind of sucks about Prophet is all of your sites are 2-1 sites, so your drains aren't particularly significant. The lightsabers allow you to be draining for 2 at those sites. You've got a ping of 1 at each site, so now you're draining 4, you're pinging 2. That's a total of 6 damage you're doing to your opponent. You can try to spread more than that to get a ping of 3 or 4, but you should be worried about a couple things if you do that. One thing you should be worried about is just spreading your forces too thin and not being able to handle a beatdown or handle your opponent coming down. You especially want to be protecting Han, right? So you want to be wary of spreading your forces too thin. You also have to remember that if you don't have a space package, you're probably going to be paying for drains, so you don't have like enough force to potentially pay for drains if you spread too thin. But this depends on the matchup, and it depends on what you've done to your opponent. Sometimes you might spread more thin, but generally speaking, make sure you're not spreading too thin. And so that's the things you should be thinking about towards the end of the game is pinging, draining, and the rest of your characters sending out to battle elsewhere on Tatooine, elsewhere at other parts of the galaxy to blow up your opponent's spot. I want to maybe go back here really briefly. One thing to note, when you go down at the audience chamber, one thing that is really important to think about is not just clearing your opponent from the audience chamber, but coming down with enough force that you not only clear your opponent from the audience chamber, but that you're prepared for the counter beat when they come back to the audience chamber. So if you come down and you just barely free Han and you don't have much left of the audience chamber, your opponent could potentially come down and destroy you the next turn. So really make sure that when you deploy to the audience chamber, you're thinking about not just getting Han, but also maintaining control the next turn after that.
No, that's a good note. I think there's always this temptation to free Han immediately to have that extra character there, right, to help secure the site, but you can kind of get screwed by secret plans and not getting the retrieval bonus. One thing I've noticed the retrieval bonus, and we talked about this a little bit, but a lot of times when you free Han, you may not even have 10 cards to retrieve, right? Like your lost pile is 6 or something, and if you're paying for it, you have to pay for the full amount, right? So you still pay 10 even if you're only retrieving 6. So
yeah, absolutely correct. So whether you have 10 cards or 7 or 6, you got to pay for the 10. And similarly, if you're retrieving 5, whether you have 5 cards in there or not, you have to pay for the full 5. And so keep that in mind.
Yeah, but this is an incredibly fun deck to play. I think this is also just for both sides like a good player experience, right? It's fun, it's interactive, it's iconic.
It's a super interactive deck. There's a lot of battling that goes on in this deck, and it's battling with like, your quintessential characters from the movies. It's a very fun deck to play, even if you're on the losing end of it.
All right, wrapping up here a little bit, what are some bad matchups here? Like heavy dark side space, like a Thrawn sort of space package, what is that, Thrawn artifact?
Yeah, I mean, if your opponent is spreading in space, that can be very tricky for you because they're draining you a lot in space and you can't really do much about it because this deck either has no space package or a token space package. But I will say if your opponent is too strong in space, then that also means they're unlikely to be strong on the ground. And you might potentially be able to win that drain race if that's what it comes to, because you're pinging and draining a lot, and then you could potentially spread more than you would otherwise. Certainly, against the mains deck, this is, I don't know who's favored, but it certainly can be tough if your opponent is coming down with a lot of weapons and a lot of big characters. It's going to be a fun time. But in the same way that you've got all these weapons and characters with cool game text and interrupts to cause your opponent problems, a dark side version of that similar kind of deck, right, that's got a lot of mains and toys, is also going to potentially give you some problems as well.
Yeah, that's ultimately one thing to think about as you're building, right? Like choosing ground or space, you cannot really choose both and execute super effectively. And usually it's better to choose ground. Space is always clunky, I find.
I think you definitely have more decks that have more of like a token space than they do a token ground. If you're only having a token package for one or the other. I mean, partly with space you can have capital starships, so it's kind of easier to have like 1 or 2 ships and and some pilots that can also work on the ground, whereas you don't really have something like that for the ground.
Yeah. There's no like levitating characters right now.
That's right.
Well, Greg, thank you for this masterclass in Prophet. This has been a lot of fun to think about sort of what the virtual format also adds to this. I think we've done a retro version of this deck, and it honestly just looks like a lot more fun and interactive in an open format. And that's one thing. If you made it this far in, you're probably very well versed with open, but open has done a lot to improve player experience and make things more interactive and a little more fun, and to correct some of Decipher's mistakes, I think. So
yeah, I mean, I will say, I mean, I pointed this out at times, but this deck has definitely a lot of virtual cards, and at least it's a lot of virtual personas of Decipher made characters. Most of the interrupts are actually Decipher cards. I'd say the vast majority of the interrupts are Decipher cards, but it's definitely heavy on virtual in terms of virtual versions of various personas and those starting effects. So, but I think they're super fun, and worth checking out. And so this might be of the decks we've talked about, potentially the most virtual card heavy deck. And so for those interested, this might be like a fun way to get into them.
Well, thank you for walking us through this, Greg.
My pleasure.
If you have questions, please leave the comment, like, subscribe, all that good stuff. We'll be back with future videos in our ongoing series. I think Greg might be running out of decks at some point. But,
we're still good for a little while longer.
This has been a lot of fun to make these, and hopefully folks enjoy checking out the virtual cards. I describe it as the V-curious folks like myself. So thanks for hanging out, everybody, and we'll catch you later.